So whereas Locke in some ways wants to say it's that cultivation that gives us to the right, he's going back again saying, no, there's nothing to do with that. This is really the most fundamental form of property there is, our own ideas. And they belong to us, and we should have rights over them. And then in part follows a tradition that develops very much in the 18th century over this idea of originality. And we saw Confucius saying, look, there's nothing original, I'm simply transmitting. But the 18th century came very, very strongly with ideas of originality in intellectual thought. Enormously significant was the work of Edward Young. He himself, in turn, was influenced by German theory on the ideas of original composition. William Wordsworth, the great Romantic poet. And more this idea that anything that comes from my mind, that's where it began and created, and that's who it belonged to. So originality starts to be the justification for intellectual property. And you can see that again in this idea of invention that comes up in the Constitution. Whereas on the other hand, you look at someone like Alexander Pope, and he's saying there's nothing really original. True wit, true ideas, is nature to advantage dressed, what oft was thought, but ne'er so well expressed. So it's really, there's nothing really original under the sun, we just think of better ways of putting it. The idea that there are only 5 tunes and 7 plots, and that all the fiction and all the music really comes from it. So again, the idea, you can't justify this on originality because there isn't really such a thing as originality. We're always picking up. Now, here you can see going back and forth, and people are not very clear as these laws are being formed of what they think and what the justifications are. So therefore, if you're not very clear, you shouldn't be too concerned either. There's Samuel Johnson, who has it both ways in some ways. He says there seems to be an author's a stronger right of property than by occupancy. So going back to that justification, a metaphysical right, a right as it were of creation, which from its nature should be perpetual. So on the one hand, if you argue from principle, it should be perpetual. But then he says, but the consent of nations is against it, and indeed reasons and the interest of learning are against it. And so you get the principled view, and then the expedient view. And this is what we're battling with the whole time. Is it principle? Is it expedient? Is it principle? Is it expedient? So, falling wildly behind in time, but let me still move on. So we have these different arguments about what this stuff is. Is it natural, or is it something that is produced by labor? Does it belong inherently to us, or is it only there by economic justification? And then the question is, well, what does that matter? Well, it matters once you start to get laws and regulation. And when you look at the laws and the regulation, just as when you look at the clause in the Constitution, you have to say, well, what is the rationale here? What's the justification? One of the things that's tricky is that states' reasons for controlling intellectual property are rather different in general from the author, those of the inventor or the author. One of the things they want to do quite clearly is control expression, particularly seditious expression. The other is that they want to make markets work. So there's the economic justification. One of the earliest regulations comes in China with almanacs. And one of the problems is that almanacs are there for people of those days. They provided a lot of standard information. When spring would begin, what was the longest day of the year, all the things we talked about in time, the shortest day of the year, what are the religious festivals, what are the main holidays. And if almanacs sold very well, always did across history, as we mentioned in printing, but if people started to produce corrupt or bad or problematic ones, then society couldn't function very well. So the state started to regulate the production of almanacs, mostly on the grounds of saying, look, the information you get from this is reliable. We have chosen just a few printers, and they are people who can be relied upon to give good data. So the notion of authenticity is there from the beginning. But another one that's important, and you see when you start to look at the early privileges, which start to look much more like patents of one sort or another, is the notion of economic competition. This is probably the first really clear patent law which comes from Venice, and it says whoever makes in the city any new and ingenious device not previously made within our jurisdiction is bound to register at the office of the Proveditore as soon as it has been perfected, so that it will be possible to use and apply it. And here you start to get the trade-off coming. You must register it, but if you do, your use of it will be protected. One of the things that it asks, though, is not necessarily that it's a new invention, but that it's new to the city. And again, you see this when you look at those articles about 19th century America. They're not necessarily in favor of new invention. They're simply in favor of new things coming to Venice. And that was part of the idea, is that you would entice people to come to your territory with their new inventions and say, we'll protect them here and make sure you have no unreasonable competition. And on the other hand, what you want to make sure, and what goes with it, but it's less spoken, is you don't want people leaving your territory and taking your ideas elsewhere. So much so that in Venice and indeed in Genoa, you actually got a bounty for killing anybody who left your state with a good idea. So artisans who worked in your print shop and then went over the border, you actually could get a bounty if you brought them back dead. So you can see that the interests here are not necessarily terribly high-minded, but this is the essence of what we start to get. We saw, when we saw it's not very well reproduced, that Venice, in fact, was enormously powerful in its laws, in that it became the center of printing in Europe fairly soon after the invention of print. We showed that map of Europe, and Speyer was probably the first, and even before they had patent law in Venice, he was given a patent for the printing press. And here we begin to get the confusion, because you're never quite sure with some of these cases, is it the work or is it the machine? Does it look like a patent or does it look like copyright? You see that, for instance, in one of the great famous printers, Aldus Manutius. He got a patent for the italic fonts, italic type. Nobody else could use italic type once he invented it. And in fact, it was pirated all across the rest of Europe, but in Venice only he or people that he allowed to. Octavo books, we talked about the different folds of books. He invented the pocket book, basically. The idea that you could carry a book in your pocket, and he was going to write on that. On Greek fonts for printing. So he got lots. There were some for music and others as well. But then there's an interesting one that comes up from a figure called Ludovico Ariosto. Has anyone heard of Ariosto? So people are going in for patents for these new machines, these new devices, particularly ones about books. Ariosto, in fact, wrote Orlando Furioso, one of the great epics of Italian literature. And he took out what could be a patent or could be a copyright on his work. And he says nobody will have the right to reproduce this. And he asks almost if he's a printer, but he's actually an author. And he starts to specify, well, whatever size book, whatever size font, no other form can this be reproduced in. And then you start to say, well, what is he really protecting? And now it's the text in many ways. It's not the shape of the book, it's not the printing technology, it's the text within the book. You get people being given by the court rights over printing. You see in France, in the 16th century, exactly the thing that happened 700 years earlier in China, that almanacs are now given very strong control. In fact, Guillaume Koch actually signs each one of his almanacs, and if it isn't signed, then you know it isn't his. And so we start to move into the world of trademarks. It's a strange case with Dürer, who had his work stolen and reproduced. He wasn't able in the end to protect his work. What he was given the right to protect was his signature, his famous monogram. So it isn't so much the work as the guarantee of authenticity of the work that seems to be important. So we switch over to England. There's a stationer's charter, we refer to this basically early on in print. And here, the Queen says, know ye that we considering and manifestly perceiving that certain seditious and heretical books, rhymes and treaties are daily published and printed by divers scandalous, malicious, schismatical, and heretical persons, and wishing to provide a suitable remedy, and she sets up the stationer's charter and says this group of printers, and Blake talked about this, they will have the rights over printing. and within themselves, they will more or less decide who owns which particular piece of copy. Now, is the Queen's interest there? Does it look as though it's in copyright? So what is her interest in? Right, so what she's really worried about is seditious speech. But for the Crown, the Court, and their administrators to go out and check every production, should they be coming up around the country, would be a hard and difficult task. So what is much better to do is to say, well, look, I'll give this bunch of printers monopoly rights, and they will know that if they produce anything seditious, they will lose those rights. So they will be more fierce than anybody else to make sure that no seditious literature is published. So what you do is you farm out control over seditious literature. And so again, you start to get this complicated relationship between the law, copyright. Copyright doesn't really come up here because anybody's interested in protecting either the printers or the author's rights. They're much more interested in controlling seditious literature. And you can see, I think, some modern equivalent of that. I mean, what the French are doing with the Hadopi law is more or less making ISPs responsible for patrolling what goes out over their networks. And that's been tried here to some extent as well. So you hand off the task and make them patrol those borders. In England, a famous act, what tended to happen and what printing grew up under was this notion of privileges. Kings would, in order to award people one thing or another, give privileges. You have a privilege to put a bridge over this river and nobody else will be allowed to. You have a privilege to provide water from this well and nobody else will be allowed to. You have a privilege to run a printing press and nobody else will be allowed to. And this was a way of both raising money and producing favors. They grew to such an extent that, in fact, in a very famous statute of monopolies, the king finally said, look, we're going to stop this. They've grown too wild, too crazy. We're now going to say that there will be no more monopolies of this sort, except that there will be one for inventions and there will be one for printing. So you can see there steps towards the Constitution. But we're going to go wipe away much of the confusion about all these different awards that are given, except in these two areas. And those are going to be the ones that are of particular interest to us. All right, so now we get more or less, finally, to the systems that we start to recognize today, that we've teased apart, inventions and writings. We get into this odd world that we've again described. We described when we talked about the rise of science, the Civil War. And the stationer's company's monopoly was more or less done away with in the Civil War. And Milton, the poet, who became the great evangelist of free speech, and said, look, we don't need any of this stuff. As he says so grandly, so truth be in the field. We don't have to worry about sedition, because truth will always win. The wonderful, wonderful idea, let her and falsehood grapple, whoever knew truth put to the worst in a free and open encounter. So printing should be free. We don't worry about sedition, because we know that as long as the reliable world of authors is out there. And therefore, and his most important statement here in many ways, is we must not think to make a staple commodity of all knowledge, and mark and license it like our broadcloth and our wool packs. So he doesn't like the idea of making it into property. He simply says, let ideas be free, and the world, whether of science or politics, will be better. But up against that come, back to the argument we've seen several times, the notion of authenticity. But once anybody can start producing anything without restriction, well, they're going to start putting out Milton's work, but they may change a few words in it. And if you don't have the author's control over it, Defoe says, not only things going to be uncorrect and imperfect, they may even be deliberately changed around. So Defoe comes back and says, no, we really need to regulate the press, because that's the only way we can guarantee that truth will be recognized in the field, because the authors are the people who control that. So the battle becomes, and we're leading towards the Statute of Anne, an important one over what kind of control there will be if the monopoly of the stationer's company is disbanded. And it becomes, in a way, a very odd battle. The country is changing. There is an idea that we saw from the Royal Society that there should be no control over words, and that there should be no privilege given to anybody speaking. But also we see that, as Jeff has talked about, that reading is spreading from this period, that politics in the public sphere. Left, then, is how, in what way should there be control over print at all? And the battle develops, and Blake again talks us through about this, primarily between the printers and the booksellers. The booksellers becoming more and more significant, the printers to some degree being left more and more in the world of mechanical derivation. But one argument, Lowenstein's argument, which is a nice one, is that these two come to a sort of standoff, where they say we need a new law, and the only thing I want to make sure in that new law is, if I'm a bookseller, I want to make sure that it doesn't give any privileges to the printers. And the printers say, look, I don't care who wins this battle as long as the booksellers don't win. So there are several attempts to pass a law, they beat each other to a standstill, till they finally come up with 1710 with the Statute of Anne. And the strange winner, who sort of percolates to the top, is the author. And the author is really there now, it seems to us, as we talked about, it's a completely natural right that the author should be there. But in fact, the author becomes this kind of odd construct, because both sides think if I put the author out there as the person who owns the copyright, I can control and manipulate the author. So let's have the author as the person who comes out at the head of the Statute of Anne. So we get our first notion of author copyright, but it's a very strange notion indeed. And yet it's the one that's going to roll into American law and roll into our current law. And in many ways you can see the roots in it, in that if you look at the RIAA or any similar body arguing about modern copyright, they're always making claims in the name of the author. But it really isn't the author they're trying to look out for. They're trying to look out for themselves. But they know that the person who gets the most public sympathy is this idea of the lone individual author trying to make a living. So in odd ways, the author becomes this strange stooge figure in the history of intellectual property. Well, you saw the Statute of Anne. You saw more or less the way that it was laid out. It is the very foundation of the copyright law that we have today. It has odd battles that go through it. We'll go through some of these very quickly. An important one, because we referred to it earlier, was the battle that went to the court of Pope versus Curll. Curll was a wonderfully salacious printer who would do almost anything for a profit. Has these wonderful books that look very, very scholarly about a treatise on the use of flogging in physical and venereal affairs. He had to defend himself in court. He had a terrible battle with Alexander Pope. When they first met, Pope disliked him so much, he put an emetic, a diarrhea-producing drug into Curll's drink and sent Curll crawling down the street. Curll produced a volume of Pope's letters. He actually bought them from people to whom Pope had sent them, and he produced the edition, and Pope sued him. And Curll said, but I own the letters. How can Pope claim he has any right into them? And in the great Solomon-like decision, the court said, well, he may own the physical letters, but you, Pope, own the content of the letters. So the physical letter and the content, the ideas and the physical instantiation start to be pulled apart. And so the idea that you can now identify this non-physical material that people own, idea that starts to be thought of as the style of the letter. So one question that Blackstone says, well, what you really own then is the unique style. The tricky thing we have is, well, how do we identify a unique trial? The booksellers, in fact, don't lose as easily, or don't give up as easily with the Statute of Anne. And they say, well, look, there may be a written law that says there's a limit on copyright. But everything before that law was written falls under common law, And for that we have an eternal right. And so right up until 1774, one family was still claiming to own all of Milton's work by common law. Finally, just as this country is becoming independent, Donaldson v. Beckett is passed, which says, no, there is no common law right. Every copyright expires after a limited time. There is no other law that applies. So it's not really until 1774 that we start to get an idea that this is finally and determinedly a limited right and not a right like property. I'm way behind. Here in the press, in the United States, we see some of these things developing. The first press in the States comes in 1638. Very soon after, or relatively soon in Massachusetts, licensing is required. You get a wonderful quotation from Governor Berkeley in Virginia saying, I thank God there are no presses in Virginia. And in fact, the press doesn't spread very quickly over here. You start to get some privileges, you get English restrictions on the press over here, but by 1775 there were only 50 printing shops in the entire country. So again, partly regulation on the press, limited quite dramatically how much. Does anyone know when the first press came to California? 1833, I think it arrives here. It's used for a little while and then it's put into storage and forgotten. And when they try to take it out again, about 1848, it doesn't work anymore and sold as dismantled. So our stories about the press spreading so dramatically and spreading independence and spreading democracy have to go up against a little amount of restriction. So we finally get to the Constitution. And the Constitution then is built out of all those historical battles that we've seen. Is it an economic right? Is it a natural right? Does it belong to the author? Does it belong to the bookseller? How long should it last? And why is it there? Well, is it simply to promote the progress of science and arts? And if it is, if it doesn't promote that, then we won't have a law on these counts. So I'm going to stop there. We'll be talking about the telephone on Thursday, and because that brings up patent law, I'll finish off, because I'm so far behind, a little bit of this, and get to at my back I was here. So just very briefly then, to the reading. So two things to read about the telephone. One is Beecham, who's arguing about patents and the role of patents in the telephone, and the other is from an important California who is objecting to the monopoly, so back to this question of monopoly, in the telegraph and its control of California. So two things to read for them. Thanks very much.